Thanks for everyone for joining this breakout on inclusive leadership during COVID-19 and beyond. I want to introduce our session speaker, Rebecca Factor. Rebecca is a people and leadership advisor at Infotech Research Group. Rebecca leverages evidence-based research to develop leaders, talent systems, and strategies that are inclusive. She has extensive experience in defining and developing a range of DE&I initiatives necessary for fostering strong, inclusive talent in the technology. A prolific voice in the communities, she often speaks at sessions like this, and she's a contributor to Canada's first Gender Equity Roadmap. Thank you, Rebecca. I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to dive right into today's content. So I will just give me a moment and I'll share my screen with everyone. So I'll preface with saying that the first sort of half of this presentation is going to be more lecture based. That's just to get sort of the fundamental terms. Whoops. There we go. The fundamental terms down in this topic area. And then once we get sort of halfway or 3/4 of the way, it will be more participation, more interactive at that point. So I'd love for you to jump in if you want to. I'll definitely specify if you can share your thoughts in the message chat. But as I said, just expect a little bit more talking from me in the first half, and then we'll get to more interaction, because definitely don't want to hear me speaking for the full 45 minutes. Just want to preface with that so everyone knows what they can expect today. So thank you so much for joining in the sort of the Develop Your Career in Tech stream. So today we're going to be talking about inclusive leadership fundamentals and definitely applying it to sort of the COVID-19 context as well. To break down what we're going to go over today, and just to give everyone sort of a brief overview, we're going to start by talking about DEI concepts. That acronym stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we'll talk a little bit about what that even means and some of the related terms that you may have heard, especially recently with the increase in interest in this area. Then we'll look at inclusive leadership behaviors, and that's really sort of the core of what we'll be talking about today, is what that really is and what that looks like. And then lastly, how can we apply these DEI concepts, inclusive behavior, to how we're working in COVID-19 and beyond now? And we'll just talk about sort of the ways that organizations have changed the way of doing things and how we can put an inclusive lens on this new way of working. So that's how we're going to end today's conversation. So I want to start with an activity before we jump into all the content. So what does inclusive leadership look like? So think of and identify behaviors that are key to being an inclusive leader. So you can do this on your own. We don't need to share yet. As I mentioned, the first half is a little bit more lecture-based. So just give this some thought in the next, several seconds. Think about, if someone asks you what an inclusive leader, what that term means, think about how you'd answer that. Think about key behaviors that you think is in this concept. And then I'd like you to rate yourself on how you think that you're doing in that area. So I'll just give a couple seconds before I move to the next slide to give everyone just time to think about that. And we're going to circle back on this exercise at the end of today's session. So just give it some thought, because you'll get the most out of today, thinking about it and then going back to it at the end. So I'll just wait 10 seconds until progressing to the next slide. Okay, so hopefully with the DEI terms. And the reason we're going to start with terminology before circling back on inclusive leadership behaviors and the new working norms is because we need to understand some of the key concepts around DE&I before moving on to applying it. this is sort of a lot of what we do in the fundamentals, is understanding some key terms, and it's only because there's a lot of gaps in knowledge in this area, because it's recently become a priority. It's recently something people think about, but we haven't yet taken the time to learn or gain knowledge in the area. So I'm going to start by just doing a brief summary and sharing some knowledge in the area, and then we'll go deeper into the core of the presentation. So let's start with diversity and inclusion, which are very big buzzwords right now. And so we'll start with diversity. And diversity is a unique trait that individuals possess. And there's sort of two key areas. There's inherent diversity and acquired diversity. So inherent diversity is what a lot of us are probably exposed of and think of when we hear about diversity. So race, gender, sexual orientation, whereas acquired diversity is more related to diversity of thought, and what you sort of gain throughout the experience of your life. Now, what is inclusion? And I think a lot of people read about different conceptualizations of what this word means. I've for sure read so many different ways to define this word, and a lot of organizations might have their own way of defining it. I really like this way that I'm about to share of thinking about it. I think it is really holistic, and it's adapted by research in the area. So really what inclusion is this balance between uniqueness and belonging. So people are then valued for their differences, but they're able to, participate and contribute freely. So okay, let's look at the image sort of on the far right here, and we can see that when you feel high feelings of belonging and high levels of value for your uniqueness, that's what it results in inclusion, right over here. But what happens when there's sort of this imbalance? And this is exactly why I really like thinking about inclusion being this balance between these two things, because you can really think about, okay, what happens if there's no balance? And how does that, affect inclusion? So if you have high feelings of belongingness, but you feel low in uniqueness, so for example, you feel really accepted and you get along with a group of people, but you notice when you're with them, you sort of change who you are and you compromise certain areas of your values, and you maybe, you're maybe not sharing certain aspects of yourself. And maybe that's when, you don't feel valued for what you bring that's unique, but you feel a high sense of belonging and is accepted by the group. And you can imagine being in a situation like that. That's not true inclusion, right? And that's where you'd fall right over here in this matrix. And I think we can all, in work or maybe outside of work, think of situations where we felt like that. On the flip side, there's situations in which you're low in belongingness and high in uniqueness. And this, there's certain situations in which you're valued for the differences that you bring, but you really don't feel a part of the group. And again, that's not inclusion, and that's where you'd fall over here in differentiation. So it's a really interesting way to think about inclusion. And as I said, it's just quite a holistic conceptualization of the word, and a good way to think about it, and a good way of what you should strive for when you're trying to create an inclusive environment and be an inclusive leader. So that is the D and the I, but what about E? So the D, E, and I, the middle E, what is that? So it stands for equity, but you might, equity has become a lot more popular. I think equality was what a lot of folks were used to before this. So equity focuses on fair outcomes and understands that people need different things to have a fair outcome, and whereas equality means that it's treating everyone equally and assuming fair access to a process rather than a fair outcome. So that's the key difference. Equity focuses on a fair outcome, whereas equality is really just equal processes for everyone and assuming that everyone has fair access, which isn't always true, given that there are certain groups that have more power and privilege than others. So that's why we focus on the equity piece, which is on fair outcome. Okay, we're almost done the conceptualizations before we dive further in. So just to warn you, we're almost done this sort of the more dry lecture part. Okay, so the last one I wanted to go over, the last concepts I want to go over is bias. And this is because I hear again and again so much about bias training, what is bias? And so I thought it was pretty important to include today. So biases are mindsets, beliefs, and prejudices that are held about specific groups of people, often for no reason at all. And there's two main types: conscious and unconscious. And conscious bias are those directly expressed, really overt and out there beliefs or attitudes that really demean or mistreat individuals who belong to certain groups, especially people who belong to marginalized groups of people. Unconscious bias is, the way that I sort of describe it is, it's bias that seeps in, often, without one's knowledge. I don't love the word unconscious. Sometimes people refer to it as implicit instead. The reason I don't like unconscious is because sometimes it takes away the accountability of us as individuals who are potentially portraying this bias and acting in biased ways. So even though sometimes it's hard to spot, we still do have some level of control over these biases. And I think that is sometimes there's some confusion over that. Like, how can I stop this bias that I don't even know about? So I just, when talking about unconscious bias, I want to preface with saying that even though it might not seep in, or it might seep in without our knowledge, there are steps that we can take to mitigate some of these. One example of that would be, in the context of interviewing people for the workplace or for a new job, some people use, completely open interviews, and there's not structured questions or semi-structured questions. And, that really leaves open a situation where bias can seep in, because instead of relying on someone's answers and their actual ability to do the job and answer the questions that you have set out, you leave the conversation completely open. And that can rely in biases such as, bonding over a similar university, the person doing the interview or hosting the interview and the candidate. So there are steps in which we can mitigate and help prevent biases from seeping in through the processes that we create. And this, don't worry, I'm not going to go over this. There's a lot of biases. That's really what I want to illustrate with this slide. There are so many different biases that we as humans have. The reason that we have them is because as humans, we are trying to preserve the energy that we have, and we take mental shortcuts so that we can quickly make decisions. And we don't use a lot of energy to make those decisions, but that is super, super harmful. In the case of what I was just mentioning in an interview where someone is, using common interests to make a decision about who to hire, that is, an example of us taking a shortcut. I have a positive association with my university, so I have a positive association with this person, and I'm going to take the chance and hire them. So there are quite a few biases here. You'll see the like me bias over here, and that's the one that I was actually just referring to. Okay, so I am done the basics. Most of the lecture now, we're going to have more thinking and more application for sure in terms of inclusive leadership behaviors. Just had to do that quick work before jumping right in. So I hope everyone sort of got a good recap of some of the key concepts and an introduction to this area. So on to inclusive leadership behaviors. So why are we talking about inclusive leadership behaviors? And I want to start with these really these really fascinating statistics about leaders. So 68% of leaders feel that they're creating empowering environments where employees can be themselves and raise concerns. So really an inclusive environment. So 68% of leaders feel that they're doing this, but only 36% of employees agree with that statistic. I think that really illustrates sort of the disconnect between what we might think we're doing or the way that we think that we're acting and how employees are actually feeling or how others are actually feeling. So even thinking back to the activity that we started with today and the activity of rating yourself, is that self-evaluation really accurate? I want, when we start diving into what inclusive leadership is, I want us to really think about, was that an accurate assessment, and what do employees think of me, or what harm or what in what ways might I not be creating an inclusive environment? Because these numbers really show the huge disconnect between our self-awareness and what's actually going on. And then you'll see down here too that the proportion of employees who do not feel included in the organization are 10 times higher than what leaders believe. And then I want to end with one more statistic on here, that 67% of leaders recognize the need for an inclusive organization, but are challenged to make it a priority. Here it says due to the pressure on delivering on short-term results. In my experience, it's also just because of a resource overload. It continues to be something that is becoming more of a priority because of just the global awareness of the importance of DEI, but I would say that it really is a challenge to become a priority, despite leaders sort of knowing that it needs to be. So I'm really glad that you've all joined me today, and I hope that this is just sort of the beginning to understanding these concepts and really being committed to being an inclusive leader and creating an inclusive environment. Okay, so as we go through inclusive leadership behaviors, definitely think back to the activity that we started with. So the ways in which sort of you defined and thought about what an inclusive leader looks like. I'd love to know, once we go through sort of the way that we think about it at Infotech, what you sort of, if it misaligns, if it aligns with what you were thinking. So we're going to go pretty high level of inclusive leadership behavior, and then we'll get more and more specific, and you'll see that in the next couple of slides. So I'm going to start and end with these really simple 4 words, a good way to remember a lot of the key concepts in inclusive leadership behavior. So it's listen, involve, recognize, and fail. And this is going to make a lot more sense when we go through the definition of inclusive leadership behavior more thoroughly. But remember these 4 concepts, because they really help to understand all of the pieces of being an inclusive leader. So let's start. Let's jump into it. So this is the inclusive leadership behavior sort of competency, and more a comprehensive way to think about it. There's quite a few pieces in here, and I'm going to keep reiterating back into these 4 pieces so that it's easier to remember. Listen, involve, recognize, and fail. So going back to this competency more intensively, I'm not a fan of, just directly reading things out, but it's really important once we talk about this just to see all of the different pieces. So there's enables an environment where people feel safe to speak openly, share insights around their own strengths, weaknesses, successes, and failures to show empathy, recognizes and rewards inclusive behavior, actively promotes and celebrates individual differences, demonstrates accountability for ensuring work practices are inclusive, and rallies employees to communicate their ideas and share different perspectives. So you'll see all of these different pieces sort of feed back into all of these 4 in different ways. And when we break down each of these more, you'll see how they feed back into listening, involving, recognizing, and failing. Before we dive even further into this sort of concept, I want to highlight that the ways in which leaders can continue to do these things and just generally behave in an inclusive manner is to stay up to date with DEI research and best practice. There's new content coming out every day about sort of the best practices and the ways that we can create a more inclusive environment. Even for myself, I've been in this space for a couple years, but it's really been a focus of mine since the beginning. And there's still things that are ever changing and that we're learning more and more about the space. So it's really important to read and listen to other folks about their experience and understand what the best practices are. It really underscores all of these other pieces. So to move forward to really understand these inclusive leadership behaviors, as I mentioned, we're going to go even deeper into it now. So we're starting really high level, and now we're going to go through sort of each of these areas and understand what actions you can take as a leader to make sure you're carrying out these behaviors. And as we go through, feel free to continue to compare it to the way that you sort of defined it at the beginning of today's discussion. So the first one is enables an environment where people feel safe to speak openly. The reason I'm smiling is because I feel often when I speak to leaders about this, that people are super sure that they are creating an environment where people feel safe to speak openly. Like, I have an open door policy, people can come to me any time. But I really want everyone to think about active steps that they're taking when they're, running meetings, when they're having one-on-ones. If they are, having an open door policy, how are they ensuring people do actively feel okay booking time, all of that. What active steps are we taking rather than just passively saying that we are, we're definitely open to anything. So the first step here is to commit to allyship. And allyship is this concept of learning and unlearning and really committing to elevating individuals. So that is a really big piece of being an inclusive leader. And a part of this concept is, instead of identifying as an ally, because we can't really do that, it's just really committing to allyship. So there's a slight difference there, but really commit to allyship and try to elevate other individuals. Modeling good listening skills. This is really integral to enabling an environment where people feel safe to speak openly, ask questions, nod, really back to the basics of active listening, but it is very important and it goes a long way, especially in the virtual environment. We miss so much of, body language. And so how are we ensuring that we're showing that we're present and we're here in terms of our listening skills over Zoom, for example. And lastly, being respectful of people's identity. So for example, people are really not going to feel safe in the environment. And this is just one example, but if people don't know how to pronounce their name. So that's one thing to think about, but there's many other pieces of someone's identity that we really need to respect to ensure that they feel safe in the space. So these are just a couple of examples, and I really hope that this sort of gets the wheels turning about what are some things that you can do, actions you can take on a day-to-day basis to enable an environment for people to speak openly, and ways that you're going to sort of start the actions on the right here. But of course, this is not a comprehensive list, and definitely think about other ways to embody this behavior on the left. Okay, the next is to share insights about your own strengths, weaknesses, successes, and failures to show empathy and help others relate. Embracing failure and apologizing. This is one of the biggest areas of inclusive leadership behavior, and I think it often gets overlooked or maybe isn't something that's thought of all the time, but it is really important. So the one thing I will say about this work is that you will make mistakes. Everyone will make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time in this field, and I just have to embrace the mistakes that I make, apologize, and really learn from that. So that is really an important piece of being an inclusive leader. And you'll see the other part in here is also to help show others that they can relate to because of the failure. So there's sort of two pieces in it. It's that, we are going to make mistakes, so let's own up to it, but let's also humanize that experience. And when I say communicate this as a priority, I mean communicate that there is time to share strengths, weaknesses, and successes, especially weaknesses. I know for some organizations, they always have, retros after projects. But for a lot of organizations that isn't a priority, or perhaps it's a priority to talk about the failures, but there's no time to talk about success. So really communicate that this is a priority and that there is space to do so. Lastly is giving credit where credit is due. This is another really big piece of inclusive leadership behavior. So when you're sharing, successes, ensure that you're also giving credit where credit is due and where employees have participated. And think about, who think about who you often credit, because there's a lot of research to show that, we're not always giving credit where credit is due. People from marginalized groups, people of color, women often get overlooked in these areas. So it's just something to be aware of as well. Next is recognizes and rewards inclusive behaviors. This part is really interesting. I don't know if this is something a lot of you have been thinking about or talking about with your organizations, but adding inclusive behavior to your values as an organization, aligning it for performance metrics or to a recognition program. So you'll see a lot of organizations now looking at adding some sort of inclusive competency, just like the one that we're sharing right now, to senior leaders performance review. And that might be something that you're thinking about right now, or maybe thinking about adding it in a more informal way. The last point here is demonstrating what inclusive behavior is. So as a leader, and that could be in a formal way, like your position and title, but it might also just be, the influence that you hold within an organization. If you're demonstrating and you're practicing inclusive behavior, others will follow, and they'll see that that behavior is valued and recognized. Actively promotes and celebrates individual differences. So the way that you might want to do that is having formalized programs to help all employees understand DEI, mitigating biases in various talent management strategies. So at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned the interview processes and sort of how having some structured questions is important to sort of mitigate the biases that might seep in. And think about it in a broader sense. That's just one example. There's so many areas in which bias seeps into talent management and people in general, and our processes of doing things, and the technologies that we use. So think about the other ways that it sort of seeps in, and think about strategies to mitigate that. And then lastly, valuing and appreciating employees and all of their perspectives as well. So we sort of talked about this in the beginning, but hearing them and really taking into consideration the things that folks are saying. Demonstrates accountability for ensuring work practices are inclusive, so drive change and help promote a business case for DEI. So this area of the inclusive leadership behavior is really about helping own how important this is at a business level. So helping to bring it forth as a priority, as we know it's really not a priority. It's often thrown aside. There's so many competing things. And again, as this becomes more something that globally we're pushing for, and that applicants and talent are looking for, it will become more of a priority, and just really help to push it forward regardless of what those sort of external events are super important to be an inclusive leader. The next point is owning DEI initiatives as you can. That on the slide doesn't super make sense, but what I mean there is I work with a lot of technology leaders, CTOs, CIOs, CPOs, and IT managers, etc. And often it feels like they aren't moving forward with DEI initiatives because it feels like it's owned with HR. But in fact, there are certain things that the department could run specifically, or the team can run specifically. So it's really important, no matter who you are, understanding your role in DEI and understanding what you could do even with the team that you have or in the department that you're in. So you don't have to wait for other people to do something. And lastly is listening to feedback from employees and acting on that to ensure that the work practices are inclusive. And that goes really well with the last piece here on rallies employees to communicate their ideas and sharing differing perspectives. So actively promoting feedback loops, listening to marginalized groups and validating their experience and ensuring that you're doing something about it to improve. And the last piece here is one of the most important, involving employees in the decision-making process. This isn't just in the process of making inclusive workplaces. This is no matter what the decision-making process is, or what the decision is about. It's just from a day-to-day, when you're working, are you involving folks in the decision-making process, and is everyone that should be there, and is everyone's ideas being taken seriously and they have the space to speak? So that really sort of summarizes sort of going deeper into the weeds of what this looks like. So we started off with something like this: listen, involve, recognize, and fail. And then we went on for a broader sort of competency of those 6 sort of skills. And then beyond that, each sort of different actions that we can do. But you can see how they all overlap and sort of can be fit into these categories of listening, involving, recognizing, and failing. We talked so much about, employee feedback, making sure they have space to speak, taking those seriously in the listen category. Involving, we talked about decision making, we talked about getting feedback for DEI, getting involved yourself, not just having employees get involved, but getting involved yourself, owning DEI, and then recognize, making sure credit is given where credit is due, and also recognizing inclusive behaviors, and lastly, failing and knowing that we're going to fail throughout this process and really normalizing that. So we went really deep in here, but I think these 4 words can really speak to a lot of what we went over. And like I said, if you're going to remember anything, this is a good 4 words to think about when you're thinking about inclusive behavior and going back to sort of your self-reflection. So next, before we circle back on the activity from the beginning, I want to apply some of these concepts to the new working world. So a question that I often get, and I was mentioning this sort of before I got started, is it's hard to know, know things that I don't know. Like, how do I know what I don't know in terms of if things are inclusive or not inclusive? And I want to talk a little bit about this in the context of the new working world and COVID-19. So what I did in the next slide is outline some of the key changes that we've gone through during COVID-19 in terms of how our working world has changed, and thought about, okay, these things have changed. How might this look for people from all walks of life? How might it differently affect groups of people? And that's something that we can all do. Actually, I know I already clicked next, so you might have seen some of the slides there, but in terms of, okay, what are some of the changes that have gone on since, March? And how might this look to people with different backgrounds? And we'll talk about that in a second, but sort of think about the changes that have gone on, and assess, like, oh, I've never thought about that, if that was inclusive or if that had issues, but, think about new technologies that have been implemented. Think about potentially new processes that are in place now. And if you think that it works for everyone, any new changes that have happened sort of gives that thought in terms of, okay, have I checked if that's working for everyone? Could there be issues? Just sort of give that some thought. And I'll go to the next slide and sort of share with you some of what I've thought about in terms of changes and how it may have differently affected groups of people. Okay, so in here, you'll see, thinking about DEI in the new working world, as I mentioned in the beginning, that this is looking at some of the changes through an inclusive lens. So I've sort of highlighted some of the key things that I've read about, that I've heard about, and that I've seen since we've sort of gone through huge organizational change and how that differently impacts people. So first, we see higher layoffs for marginalized groups of people of color, and women have been laid off at a way higher percentage. So that is one of the biggest things that we've seen occur. And we know that there has been huge layoffs, but being aware of the groups that are being heavily affected is really important, and understanding the nuances of DEI in and post-COVID, something to think about. Something else that I've sort of seen is the child's care responsibility and work-life overload, and who this is likely to fall onto. So understanding what that's looking for employees, and potentially specifically women that this falls to, and how that looks and how they're managing all of these responsibilities. And as I walk through some of these, because this is a brainstorming activity that I'm sort of sharing with you in this context, feel free to, as I mentioned, think. You can also share in the chat, and we can get to it in the next couple minutes, and I'll stop sharing, and we can also go over some of those as well, because I'd love to hear them. Another is acclimatizing new hires. So that can be a big area where inclusivity can really play a big part. So now that we're in this new working world, potentially working remote, working virtually, what does acclimatizing new hires look like? Have you created a process in where people really feel a part of the group and feel safe to share? Just going back to that inclusive leadership behavior there. Inclusive product use. So many folks have implemented collaboration tools, communication tools, and just making sure that they work for everyone. So for example, when you're buying a product suite, are you looking to see if they are up to standards with accessibility? With, one example here that I put is, having subtitles, when you're talking, so that people can read them if they're hard of hearing, for example. The next piece is who is being seen and promoted. That happens whether or not we're in a virtual world, but it could just be worsened when we're working from home, because you can't overhear what's going on and sort of insert yourself potentially if you feel like you're often let out of the loop. So it's a little bit harder. So just being mindful of things that are going on, meetings that are being booked, and if everyone is there. And again, going back to, is credit being given where it should be? And that goes into the next point of really being purposeful in meetings and ensuring that everyone is going to be there. And this goes back to the inclusive leadership behavior of really ensuring that everyone is involved in decision making. And the last two that I'll mention before closing up is wellness and loneliness. This is a huge problem. We all know this. We know that employees are really struggling, but let's think about, again, how are these changes affecting different groups more negatively? We know that potentially people that are away from friends and family, for example, immigrants who maybe their family is still back at home, they can't fly there, they have to stay here and they can't see them. That can be a huge challenge and really hard for them and really impacts their work. And lastly, I'll mention office space and equipment. This can become an inclusive DEI issue because those folks who don't have space in their house and they don't have the proper equipment, that's going to be associated with potentially, in some instances, lower social economic status, where they don't have a home, they don't have a separate space for an office or stuff like that. So there's obviously different groups also that I haven't mentioned that will be negatively affected by some of these changes. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is the way that we can start thinking about changes, processes, and the ways that we do things, and start to really dissect, okay, does this work for everyone? And how might this, not? And what does this look like for different groups of people? And so that was really what I sort of wanted to illustrate here, especially in the context of changes during COVID-19, and really the way that we'll be working for the future, because we know remote work really is here to stay to some extent. So as I promised in the beginning, I want to circle back on the activity here. So what does inclusive leadership look like? So I hope you had a chance to sort of think back and see how your definition, if it aligned with what we discussed today, or if there was some misalignment. And what I'd really recommend is, after sharing the information I did today, is re-rating yourself on inclusive leadership and thinking about, if your rating has changed, or if it has or if it hasn't. I know we only have 5 more minutes. So if we do have a chance, once we stop, if there's no questions, I'd love to hear from any of you who want to share if your rating sort of had changed pre and post today. And then last, I'd really recommend looking forward from today and continuing learning. One thing that I really recommend is working through some of the key behaviors that I identified today, and looking at what to stop, start, and continue as leaders to really make a commitment to actions you'll take to continue being an inclusive leader. So I will stop sharing now, because I know that's a lot of talking for me, and so hope time to open up the floor and ask any questions that you might have.
So while we're waiting for questions, I'll ask you one, Rebecca. When you talked to, I thought it was really interesting, the conversation that you were having about people are not always aware of their own level of inclusiveness. As you've done this exercise with other people, where you start with rate yourself, and then they come back and they're like, yeah, I don't do that so much. What are the areas that you think we have the most blind spots around, that we think we're doing, but we're not actually doing?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I think one of the most recent one, and maybe I'm just thinking of this because it recently happened. But I think meetings is one of the biggest blind spots people have. Like a lot, and then this happened before COVID, where people would grab each other and just say, oh, let's just meet. And they would totally omit other folks that really should be there to help the decision-making process and have that opportunity to speak. That's probably one that potentially has improved since the virtual world, where our meetings are more purposeful. But I think the informal nature of some initiatives in organizations is maybe the aha moment for some people. Like, oh, we had a special project and we just asked this person, and we start a conversation of how did you choose them, or did you ask other people? And they realized we don't have a formalized process, and they didn't think it was as problematic. So I think like meetings and some informal, basically what I'm trying to say is informal initiatives, like meetings that you're just like brainstorming and grabbing people, or special projects. People don't realize how informal activities can be so harmful in the area of bias, and how the people that they choose to be a part of that are usually, their friends, or, people from a certain group.
Yeah, that's, yeah. My guess, I'm sitting here evaluating myself. I'm like, how am I doing this? And thinking, am I good at this or not? Boy, I think formalizing that a bit better, or, it's always that point of, I think as a leader, you have to, and you have a bias towards action. You're making decisions fast. You sort of have to in a lot of cases. And one of the things I've learned so much in this journey of inclusivity is trying to take a step back before I make a decision and think about, who have I asked about this, and have I gotten all the feedback, and I may need to do a better job on that one too.
But and what you're saying, the decision-making one is huge. Like that's actually like one of the slides that I removed because it was just getting too content. There's so much content we could cover, but that type of bias where it's just like a quick decision, and this has worked in the past, so I'm going to do it again without asking anyone else. Again, that's the one that people think is just a strategic move. Like, this is just, I need to make this decision, so I'm just going to do it. It's worked in the past. But that, allows for so much bias. And also, you're an expert on your own experience, but all of us just live our own life. Like, we don't know what someone else has to give and offer us. And when we make decisions fast without understanding everyone else's experience, we're not going to make the best decision.
Yeah, it's a good one. I see some chat on the side. Some folks have some tips and a couple other things to say. Any other questions? Does anybody else want to jump on, ask a question before we wrap it up? I think people are just absorbing. Now they're rating themselves.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
yeah. And I can see, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I can see in the chat, I know it's a little after, but someone posted a website for allies. That's great. And I think I can't remember now if I mentioned this, but a really cool thing about sort of allyship is that it's something to commit to for life. And it's learning and unlearning, and it's forever. And that's the same with inclusive leadership behavior is, you can't call yourself an ally. You're committed to the behavior, and this is a long time commitment. So it's not just, coming today and then you're done. But I'll just leave you with that this is just the beginning, and hopefully I've just sort of elicited a self-reflection and thought.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a life. I always look at that as a benefit, because I feel like I'm learning all the time, and I get this opportunity to get better and better, because I don't have to just, I don't have to know it all today either. As I've learned to be a better ally and just a better person, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This was terrific. I loved it. I saw some comments on it too about the listen, involve, recognize, and fail. Like, I thought that was really like just a short way to think about those behaviors. I think that is a definite takeaway.
Perfect. That's what I wanted. I wanted everyone to take away something today. So I'm glad.
Awesome. So for everyone that is attending this session, the session's over, and this actually completes the major content of our day one of the 2020 summit. And we want to thank you all for being with us today. It was such great energy all day, for the whole session. It was really wonderful. Thanks everyone for coming, and we will see you tomorrow. And thank you again, Rebecca, for a great session.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.